My kitchen looks out over a historic cemetery that dates back to the 1800s and possibly earlier. On my daily walks past the stones that mark the graves of those who graced this planet before me, my eye is always drawn to the markers which sometimes still bear the details of that person's life. This somehow gives their final resting place a certain vitality, if one can use that word when talking about death, that takes me back to what I imagine was a life not dissimilar to mine, filled with trials and tribulations, joy and regret, and most of all, the realization that our time to live is finite. Many of the headstones are still legible and describe the age of death, usually to the month and the day, many of children, and even more of young men and women, whom in this modern era we would consider to have been taken well before their time. But in the late 1700s and early 1800s, life expectancy was just below 40, and childhood diseases, which today are easily treated, were often fatal. So who was J.B.? Certainly not one of the more influential parishioners at Holy Trinity Church. His nondescript stone off to one side by the property line that separates the cemetery from a golf and country club bears only those two initials. Weather and time have erased everything else. About a month ago, I noticed that JB's stone was missing. Having been out of the country for some time, I assumed that it was being attended to by the church staff. But somehow in the back of my mind, this seemed an unlikely explanation. And then suddenly one day there it was again, not in its usual spot by the property line, but instead laying next to another stone, almost as though it had been placed there by whomever had taken it in a moment of remorse. Now, I don't presume to be Stephen King, not by any stretch of the imagination. However, I had the compelling urge to write about J.B. without an iota of evidence as to who he was, how long he had lived, what he did, or whether he was a good or bad person. Did he have a wife, children? Was J.B. even a man? But like the famous author, I felt that this story would be not told by me, but rather through me. So here goes. J.B. lived in Thornhill in the early 1800s. He arrived shortly after the American Revolution in 1783, a loyalist, in search of a new place to live and work, welcomed by the British to help settle what was then Upper Canada. As a young man of 17, J.B. set to work clearing trees and building homes under the leadership of John Graves Simcoe, who encouraged settlement and the construction of roads such as Yonge Street to facilitate the movement of troops, supplies, and communication. At 21 years of age, J.B. married Margaret, who had arrived from Britain in 1801. Shortly after their union, Margaret fell ill and died of consumption, without having given J.B. any children to bear his name. J.B. continued to live and work in Thornhill, then known as Thorne's Mill, until his own death at the ripe old age of 32. As J.B. was not a man of means, but rather a hard-working settler, who regularly attended the Holy Trinity Church, still standing to this day, his grave was marked by a simple stone that bore the following inscription, which the passage of time and nature itself have mostly erased. J.B. died March 3rd, 1812, a true pioneer. Forgive me, J.B., if this story leaves much to be desired. It is written as an ode to your life, filling a blank page with some semblance of the person you may have been all those years ago.